although there was physical colonialism in the sense of the British being present in our country and ruling over us, there was also kind of psychological colonialism, because colonialism also takes over your head.
What do you think that when the British were leaving India in 1947 and someone told them 75 years from now, a prime minister of your country will be somebody called Rishi Sunak?
The British imagination, they were not ideally creating thinkers in India, they wanted to create clerks.
How were British telling the India story? And who are these characters? Who are writing these stories?
Colonialism ultimately is about telling that story also, because the British also had to constantly justify why they were here, which means they had to always make brown people look like idiots who didn't know what they were doing. So either they had to be like, these brown people are killing each other, Hindu-Muslim issues, or they had to say that they don't know how to rule themselves because they're useless.
Manu, welcome back. Last episode we talked about this idea of India and why it's relevant and how it is evolving. One of the big thing I think is related to idea of India is our whole history with colonialism. It's been for nearly 500 years. Somebody or other was ruling over India for their own interest. Some people, Mughals came from outside but assimilated themselves deeply in India. During the time of Mughals, India was by and large doing well. And these days people quote statistics that India was 500 years ago 25% of world GDP and so on. Who knows how authentic those economic data figures are, but probably directionally right. It was a reasonably prosperous country.
Yeah.
And the Mughals were among the in that era among the most powerful emperors anywhere in the world. How much aware they were of the just what was happening in Europe and America? There was an active trade and migration to America and so on. Were they even aware of all these things?
They were certainly aware, but to a certain degree. For example, I don't know about America, but they're certainly aware of things happening in Europe, partly because there were European artists coming here and painting for them. In fact, European Renaissance art influences show up in Mughal art because there is a kind of exchange happening there. It was fashionable to get exotic things from Europe and present it to the Mughal emperor. I think it's Jahangir. There's in fact a portrait of him sitting in Darbar, and it shows a bunch of other rulers from around the world in the painting sort of looking up to him. It's again a work of propaganda. In that you see the English king. The King of England is also featured in that painting, right at the bottom, I think, looking up to the Mughal emperor as if the Mughal emperor is some great figure. So clearly they were aware, clearly they wanted to make a political statement that we are the legitimate item, and these guys are all like chota mota kings around us, and we are the center of the world. These are the kind of smaller planets revolving around us. So there was awareness of what was happening there. In multiple places, even in smaller kingdoms, you find these Westerners being quite surprised that these Indian rulers were very interested about things happening in Europe, the wars that were breaking out, succession disputes, things like that. So they did have an interest, but I don't think it was a very tall interest in the sense that they had enough happening here. They were very secure in their wealth and power, that they didn't take an extraordinary interest in what was happening in Europe, because to them Europe was a backwater. As Shah Jahan famously complained, these are people who don't even wash their bottoms. Why should we take too much interest in these people? That was the attitude. So
it's incredible, yeah. If you sit back and think about it, I think it's as early as year 1600. There's a Mughal empires in India where they had incredible resources at their disposal, right? Versus most of the European kings were very small courts, hardly any resources, and how the history unfolded for next 200-300 years is just mind-boggling.
Yeah.
But so let's fast forward that at some point East India Company set shop in India. Slowly they start to gain influence. So this going back to the idea of colonialism, at what point did British started to become deliberate about they need to quote unquote reform society, homogenize things, and so on? Like where the original roots of that starts when?
With the British, I think by around 1800, there is a clear sense of we are now starting to build an empire. So there is the then Governor General. He actually in his writings refers to an Indian empire. Because what's happened is in earlier phases, East India Company men would come and rule, people like Warren Hastings, etc. Often they were of relatively obscure backgrounds who got into these positions, came here as traders, and trade was often the incentive. So in a place like Madras, etc., from the 1600s, they're having established that little enclave there. They're the ones adjudicating caste disputes, etc., because they want to keep things as they are and just trade quietly. They don't want to get involved too much in politics. Just carry on and make a profit. What happens is that by the end of the 18th century, you find more and more people of the elites becoming part of this process. And elites always have this desire for glory also. Elites want something more than just profit. So, they are not interested that much in just, Lord Wellesley, etc. They're not interested just in money. They're interested in making a statement. They're interested in some kind of empire building activity. That's when you see that they are starting to take a conscious interest in India as an empire. Even then, officially, that word isn't really articulated for much longer, but at that time, you see the initial trends beginning. The influence of civilizing people is also an overlap between empire and Christian missionaries. Because by the early 19th century, there's a lot of pressure to let missionaries into India. The East India Company is actually against it. The higher echelons of it are absolutely against getting religion into this because they think religion will unnecessarily create issues in India. Indians will happily tolerate British rule if the British play on Indian terms. That's why, as I said in the last episode, Englishmen were making donations to temples. Roose Peter makes a donation to the Madurai Meenakshi. In Thiruvananthapuram Padmanabha Swami temple, this man called Colonel Munro, he goes and gives a silver umbrella to the deity. In Tirupati, there's something called the Munro, some kind of vessel that, a sort of endowment that a Munro created. These are all things created because they wanted to, in a sense, suck up to local people and say, look, we're not all that alien. But the moment Christian missionaries come in, it's no longer just about controlling territory, it's about transforming these people's culture, which means you have to transform their religion, their ideas, etc., etc. That is when tension starts to build up, and you find that a lot of evangelical officials, there are officials, because the missionaries are also coming out of England. And in England, there's this huge religious churn happening. And young men who are raised in that churn, they're the ones coming to India as well. So they also end up showing a kind of missionary zeal. And that's when you see this whole civilizing mission conversation beginning, which is that we are here because God has intended us to be here. We are not here because of, a series of accidents and lucky incidents, but we are here because God wanted it, and it is our duty, therefore, to transform these people. The same stance that the Portuguese had taken before them in Goa a couple of centuries ago. And that's what happens here, and that's how they start interfering in religious and social aspects, caste, etc. So it can be as little as in Vellore in 1806. There's this incident where there's a mutiny of the East India Company troops. Now, the East India Company later says that Tipu Sultan's family, who was living in the fort, they're the ones who instigated it, etc. But the core issue was that the East India Company had changed the uniforms of all the soldiers. They'd given them standardized turbans, and they'd also said your moustache has to be standardized, your facial hair has to be standardized. Now, for the Indians, it was shocking because your turban gives away, as we discussed last time, your caste position, your social status. How you twirl your moustache decides whether you're a Rajput or whether you're some other community, whether you're a Muslim or a Hindu. So they felt that their identity was being attacked, and and here Tipu Sultan's family apparently played a role where they taunted these people saying that you guys are being converted to Christianity without even realizing it. And that apparently affected these soldiers, and that was a major trigger for the Vellore mutiny. So even something as simple as the facial hair on the face of on the upper lip of a soldier ended up having political consequences.
Yeah. And this 1806 and so on, this is still East India Company operating. They're officials deciding these changes.
Correct. And again, it's not entirely united yet. So even though in Vellore, the local officer issued the orders and implemented them, I think in Hyderabad, similar orders went, the local official refused to implement them because he foresaw that this can lead to trouble, and he tried to delay it for as long as possible because local officers also had a lot of control. That's the other thing, right? Technology, how much it plays a role. In earlier times, even British officials posted in various princely courts. In the early 19th century, before the telegraph came in, you couldn't supervise them that easily from Madras or Calcutta or wherever. So they had a lot of leeway in how they exercise British power. There was a lot of flexibility. After the telegraph comes in, these guys become less and less powerful because they're being constantly nannied from higher authorities sitting in Madras or Calcutta or Bombay. And then you have control directly coming from there and orders coming here. And these guys just turn into middlemen. Their room for maneuver reduces, which means their flexibility reduces. Their ability to say, actually hold on, local conditions need to be considered before you give this order. That ability is sort of diluted. So it's this mishmash that's taking place.
And, so you have, this essentially a corporate ruling over large swath of a, country. But they were getting a lot of support from British Navy and so on. So how was that arrangement? Why was, the British king's navy protecting, supporting, helping them fight? What was it? Was just they're paying for it, or what was the whole arrangement?
No, so initially the East India Company was its own autonomous element, but from the start itself, as soon as it started turning profits, you find that more and more people are invested in the company. So MPs are shareholders in the East India Company, which means MPs also don't want the East India Company to fail. By the 1780s, the East India Company is in financial trouble. They've drained Bengal of a lot of its vitality. Bengal, there's famine, there's a breakdown of revenues. East India Company is struggling. It needs a loan from the British government. It's also invested in banking systems in Britain, which means that if the East India Company fails, it has a huge ripple effect back home in Britain on powerful interests that are settled in Britain, which means British people also can't let it collapse. So East India Company essentially reached that cliched place of being too big to fail. You had to somehow you had to somehow make sure it stayed afloat, just because you couldn't let it collapse and then destroy everything else at home. So in that respect, there was some support already from the state to the East India Company. And slowly from the 1780s, 1760s really, you find that the state becomes more and more influential in deciding East India Company activities. So eventually there's a board of control that's formed, where the government also has a say in how East India Company things are decided. There's also conflict. So again, this is not one unitary system, right? So guys in India want something to happen. Guys in London want something completely different. They're often telling the guys in India, please don't fight wars. We don't want territory. We just want profit. Stop fighting expensive wars. But nobody in India is actually listening to them, because by the time these letters reach, 6 months have passed, wars have already been fought, kingdoms have already been seized. Then you can't hand it back over. So you end up consolidating what you have. The board of control doesn't like what these guys in London are also doing. So there's conflict constantly at every level. Yet, everybody's in some way or the other invested in the same venture. And eventually the British government kicks out the East India Company altogether after the rebellion and simply takes over.
But I'm very curious, until then, what was the arrangement? Was East India Company paying huge amount of taxes, which will go into exchequer, and then the British government will, because, army and navy, they're expensive, to have. So someone needs to pay for it. So how were the financial arrangements like here?
I don't think there was any fixed tribute as such. There were taxes, certainly. But beyond that, I don't think there was any fixed sort of tribute that was given, at least not till a certain period. I think at a certain point in Bengal, it started becoming remunerative for the British government also. They were starting to get a certain chunk out of it. But more often than not, the British government had to also bail these people out and keep things going.
Because of vested interest.
Because of all kinds of vested interest and financial issues. The East India Company from the 1760s was facing financial issues and needed saving every now and then. And the British government, each time it saved them, it also sort of strengthened its own stranglehold on the East India Company. And slowly, therefore, even though in 1858 it's the East India Company in power, the government already has enough control over the entity. So for them also, over a period of time, it wasn't so much about money as much as control.
Yeah. So let's look at what are things, British, both under East India Company and later on, as a formal British colony. What are things they worked on, which is, kind of all clubbed under the umbrella of colonialism? What are things they did? And first and foremost, I guess, has to be just English language itself. Growing up, I remember, people say, Angrez chale gaye, but Angrezi chhod gaye, And today also, so much of what happens in the, official circles in India and all that, English is the, primary language of communication. So how did, just the resurgence of, not resurgence, I mean, emergence of English, how did it unfold over?
So initially they stuck to Persian. That's the language that they used. It was only in the 1830s that formally Persian was kicked out, and they felt confident enough to now impose English, because they felt now we're powerful enough that locals will start learning our language, because we've in a sense unseated Persian as the language. So you find a lot of Persian munshis, etc. being kicked out, and now it's English speakers who are the new sort of talented class. Learning English becomes an access to a government job, which means kids now, they put into schools where often even missionary schools. They send to missionary schools not to learn about Christ or convert, but just so they can pick up the language and get a government job and then end up in a lucrative position in the East India Company service in the country. So it was a sort of gradual process, and then English acquired its own value. You find that Indians often asked for English. So Raja Ram Mohan Roy, for example, at one point the British, I think, wanted to set up another Hindu traditional institution. And Ram Mohan Roy was among those who said, no, we don't want this. We want English education. Because English gives us access to modern science. It gives us access to a whole lot of knowledge, which we need for our own personal, social, economic development. So Indians recognized very early on that this one commodity that the British had brought in was of use to us. So that's why I don't feel any guilt about English continuing in 21st century India, because we took it over willingly. We wanted it because we had a strategic advantage in taking it over. It wasn't forced on us in that sense. We were also anxious for it because we wanted it. And this kind of dynamic is something that complicates colonialism in general. We think again that the British came and just took over and we were all just like, oh my God, how horrible. But you take an instance in 1803 where the Marathas are defeated and the British East India Company reaches Rajputana for the first time. The Rajputs welcomed them. The Rajputs were keen to have the British as their suzerains because the Rajputs were fed up with the Marathas. For the last 50, 60 years, the Marathas had sort of sucked Rajputana dry. So many issues there. They hated the Marathas that anybody who defeated the Marathas could only be a friend, and they actively welcomed the British. So earlier we had discussed how there were always people who were willing to collaborate. It wasn't so much collaboration, but for their own survival sometimes, because Indians were also fighting each other. We weren't one group having a nice little party till the British came. We were also not getting along with each other. In that dynamic, the British ended up serving some people well, and those people wanted further British influence. So politically, the Rajputs wanted British suzerainty. Culturally, a lot of Indian intellectuals wanted the English language. So it's not a simple black and white kind of thing. It's a much more complicated thing.
And the same choice, around at the time of independence, and that's a probably big choice that when the constitution was being drafted, whether you continue with English or you make a significant transition, which could have been painful. Partition was painful, but people made that choice. We'll talk about that. How was this, language issue handled at the time of independence?
I think by kicking the bucket further down the road, they initially said a certain number of years and then we will transition to Hindi or whatever. But obviously in the South, that was never going to fly. Even though now, organically, Hindi is picked up in the South. People tend to speak the language. People have learnt it for functional reasons. If you want a job elsewhere, you end up picking up some Hindi or the other. So in that sense, even in Bangalore, Kerala, etc., some degree of Hindi is there. But at an emotional level, at the level of prestige and cultural assertion, people still don't want Hindi because they think this is a North Indian language from the Gangetic belt. Why should people in Punjab and Bengal and Orissa and South India speak a language that comes from elsewhere? It feels almost like cultural imperialism. And that's the other thing, right? Earlier I gave the reference to the Marathas and Rajputana. The Marathas were Indians ruling over Indians, but they were seen as an imperial force in many places. In Bengal, they were not at all welcome. There are songs, there's something called the Maharashtra Puran in Bengal, which actually has a very villainous, negative image of the Marathas. Same in Gujarat, where the Gaikwads of Baroda went and ruled. The local Gujaratis did not like it at all because they saw themselves being ruled by a foreign power. It wasn't a foreign race, but it was a power that spoke a different language, believed in different forms of culture or whatever, had a completely alien existence vis-a-vis the local Gujarati people who lived there. So it's interesting that, colonialism in that sense, Indians had a kind of intra-Indian version of it also. And not just in Hindu states, in Hyderabad, for example, the Hyderabad Nizams used to get these Muslim experts and professionals from North India to come and serve in Hyderabad. And that created a problem in Hyderabad, saying this is for local Muslims. Why we got these North Indian Muslims? Those issues are, these issues around language and Hindi imposition and all of that, patterns of that have existed earlier also, where people have moved, people have said, oh, this is cultural imposition or a form of cultural colonialism. When linguistic groups have dominated, similar issues have arisen. So in that sense, it's not new. We're just dealing with an old problem in a new format.
So language in one area, but other big area where I think that at least there's a lot of debate is people feel that the whole education system, the way it has been designed, in some ways has a huge colonial hangover in it, because a lot of the modern education system was set up by British, I think in late 19th century as part of huge wave of reforms, etc. So how has in your opinion, how has that evolved? Who were the players involved? What happened? At what time they said, okay, we are going to have British style education system for the country, schools and higher education, so on, and what has been the evolution of that?
So that was also a big debate in the first half of the 19th century, where people were in two camps, and the British themselves were in two camps. One side felt that no, we are here as a foreign race, like people like Malcolm and Thomas Munro and that group. They all of them felt that we're a foreign race. We should not upset local people too much. We should be seen to be patronizing their education. So if the Mughals built a madrasa, we will build an even bigger one. If the Mughals or local Hindu Rajas gave grants to Brahmins, we will give even bigger ones. So when they conquered Pune, for example, and the final Peshwa was exiled in 1818, 1819, the British came over and they started giving gifts to Brahmins and doing the danams and the dakshinas that the Peshwas used to do, because they wanted to show that we are not going to upset or disrupt this system. The others felt no, including some of these people who thought we were here to civilize the nation, the people. They thought that we must give them modern education. Modern education means Western languages. We don't want to see whether the different kinds of seas in which Vishnu is reclining. They need to learn modern science and chemistry and physics, which means they need to have that technical language, and that language is available in English. Therefore, pick up the English language. Interestingly, there were Indians who tried to blend this. So there was in Tanjavur, there was a Raja called Sarfoji, the man who put together that Saraswati Mahal library we mentioned last time. He, for example, and then there's a scholar called Indira Peterson who's working on a biography. So she shows how he basically took Western ideas around geography, around astronomy, etc., but put them into traditional Tamil formats of poetry, the Korovenji play format, etc. And so basically kids would not be confused. In their familiar format of storytelling, they were getting Western science, because the king himself designed these kinds of things and tried to put it out through his schools. But that kind of thing is a long-term process. It's a painstaking process. Most people want a simple fix and they wanted to move on. Government is also ultimately a giant bureaucracy. It has plenty of other things to do. It has no time to sit and design a nice, perfect kind of system. So eventually it was decided that, look, Western education it is. That's what Indians also want, because again, Indians are also responding to economic incentives. English gives you access to a job. We don't care about science and chemistry. We want a job. And if job comes in English, chalo, we will study English. So that's how this transition happened to a Western system. In the British imagination, they were not ideally creating thinkers in India. They wanted to create clerks. They wanted to create people who would service the imperial machinery at lower levels, not get too ambitious to take senior positions, at the same time be competent enough to do all the grunge work. And that was the intended kind of, target audience or target constituency they were creating. A lot of other people who did shift from this were lawyers. Legal profession turned out to be where all the nationalists come from, which is interesting, right? Because the legal profession, you're not beholden to the government. You've learned English, but you're also autonomous. You can make tons of money on your own. They're the ones who then started supplying nationalism. Whereas the ones who went into clerical service largely stayed supportive of the government, did not want to rock the boat too much. So Indians also saw that divide among themselves. So again, it's a very complicated, strange kind of dynamic that took place. But by the 1860s, etc., it was quite clear that English education was winning in India.
And some of the founding fathers of India, people who got involved in even freedom struggle early on, they're all comfortable with this Western style of education system, or they had their own?
I mean, they gained from it, right? So, but that's the thing. We should never assume that because they studied a Western style thing, they were suddenly deracinated or they ceased to be Indians. Look at all of them. They studied English. Many of them even went abroad and studied at Cambridge and Oxford and places, but they came back and became nationalists. Because in a sense, it empowered them, and especially exposure to England made them realize that, hold on, there are ways to fight this using a system that the British themselves can't say no to. It reverses and raises a kind of mirror to the British, saying, you're doing all this moral hoo-ha in your own country, saying, look at us, we are democracy, this, that. What about us? We're going to hold up a mirror to you in your own language, so you can't even run away. You can't even pretend you aren't understanding. We're going to make sure you understand. So we sort of took it over and turned it around into a weapon, rather than, simply meekly obeying or following what the British intended. The British intended for us to be clerks, but we ended up becoming something else in the process.
And same thing, at independence time, was there an emphasis on overhauling education system significantly, or we borrowed, liberally from what was built and continue to kind of build upon them and incremental changes?
I'm not an expert on that, but as far as I know, we largely continued with the same broader system. We haven't really changed much. And it is true that this argument has some value to it, which is that I think Indian children should be exposed to the Kalidasas of Indian culture and things from within our culture. It doesn't even, it's not even like you're expecting all kids to learn Sanskrit. You can even translate, tales from, the Katha, Sarit Sagar or something like that. Expose kids to that. If you're teaching kids stories anyway when they're in the smaller classes in kindergarten and so on, you can have stories that come out of Indian, contexts. When I was growing up, I still remember we would read books in which people had marmalade for breakfast, and they had all these things that were Western in origin. We never actually had those kinds of breakfasts, but somehow books we read for leisure were always about these things, which again, at one level it exposes you to that, but at the other level you also think, but why? We could have easily been consuming literature that was much more relatable to us as Indians coming out of our culture. So there is, I think, some scope for that, but it should be done in a mature way. Right now the fashion seems to be claiming things like, oh, Indians had aircrafts 5,000 years ago, and, we did plastic surgery and did head transplants and so on. Yes, we did plastic surgery, but we did not transplant any heads. Things like that. That's a bit comical. Our greatness should not take us into areas of stupidity. Instead, we should be talking about how the Harappan civilization had bathrooms sometimes on the first floor of a building. In a country where we're still facing an open defecation problem, what is it that 4,000 years ago, our ancestors in one part of the country had the technology and the system to have indoor bathrooms? That is something that we should be discussing perhaps, and even, taking pride in, because those are real achievements. We don't need to invent achievements, because that then makes us feel insecure. It feels like you're plugging in insecurity about the West and trying to invent all these great things.
A lot of this thing, what we consider, colonialism, a lot is probably evolved organically, right? As opposed to deliberate plan that someone, but if you scan, that period from 1800 till 1950 and what happened, are there things systematically the British did which change the fabric of society in some significant manner, good or bad, which is at least, modern India need to think about it seriously and see what do we want to do with that, continue to work with it, reform it, change it, or throw it away and start all over again.
One is, I think, legal systems. They had an interest and an incentive in centralizing things. The thing is, they are foreigners ruling over a deeply diverse, complicated society. So frankly, for them, the best thing would have been having a simple legal system, one set of laws for everybody. Except in India, that was very tough. One caste may not allow widows to remarry, another caste may allow widows to remarry. So then, how do you treat them at the same level? You can't. Everything is highly subjective. In Kerala, the Nayars had a polyandrous system if they so desired, where women could have more than one husband. In North India, it was polygamy, where men could have more than one wife, but the women were always kept sequestered and they were not allowed that kind of sexual autonomy. Again, very different, behaviors. Both are Hindu communities, both are part of the same Indian broader set, but they behave very differently. How do you legislate similarly for people like that? So the British ended up creating a giant mess. At one point, they fell back to all the Dharma Shastras, saying that we're going to now interpret this, and this is Hindu law for everybody. Except that's never how it worked. It was never rigidly implemented like that. Local customs, local variations, these are the things that determined, how law operated. For example, the Dharma Shastras, you're not allowed to kill Brahmins. But you have plenty of examples of Brahmins being killed by kings and others happening, and in the Dharma Shastras, if you kill a Brahmin, then you're also going to lose your life. But in the Peshwa records, you find cases where people are just paying fines and getting off with it. So how do you, reality versus what the British thought should be happening. The British were also trying to be traditional by interpreting from the Dharma Shastras. But imagine the fast, white people trying to interpret Sanskrit texts and literally impose that on a society. It's going to lead to chaos. Eventually, of course, they create the later system with their standardized laws and as far as possible on civil, subjects at least. But it, is something that is still complicated. In our country, you cannot necessarily even now have one-size-fits-all rules for everybody everywhere. So that's one thing that's there. The other thing is even this idea of reform, right? In Kerala, where I come from, women used to walk around topless. It wasn't a big thing. Everybody, upper caste women, lower caste women. Nowadays, people think it was just lower caste women who were prevented from covering their upper bodies. But that wasn't true. We have plenty of evidence, visual evidence, etc. Brahmins, Naya women, all of them largely walking around topless. And then suddenly this new gaze comes in saying that, oh, women's bodies have to be perceived a certain way. Women have to be covered up a certain way. Which means, and because colonialism is dominant, men are going out from these communities to study in English colleges. They're also internalizing this. So they're also coming back and saying, yes, women must be covered up forever and they must be, chaste and well behaved. They shouldn't have multiple husbands. They should only have one husband, etc. So suddenly you find a local custom changing and it's shown as a reform. But that reform is complicated because it also is a way of putting these women in their right place, as it were. There's a novelist called Aubrey Menon whose mother was Irish, I think, and his father was Malayali. And the mother came for the first time to Kerala to see her mother-in-law, the Malayali lady. And the maidservant went to fetch her, and then she came running back and told the mother-in-law, oh, your daughter-in-law sitting there fully covered up, because she's an Irish lady. The mother-in-law is scandalized, saying if she's covering herself up, she must be preparing for adultery, because no respectable woman would cover herself. Respectable women walked around topless. Now that was the local culture there. You have a case where M.G. Ranade and his wife go up, I think, to Punjab, and Mrs. Ranade goes to take a dip or to take a bath in the river, and she's on her sari and she's taking her bath with her clothes on, and the local women are there like, is this how you Maharashtrian ladies take a bath? Like, don't you take your clothes off? Because even the bathing styles were different in different parts of the country. Now, in that situation, imagine foreigners trying to create a system for everybody. So there's something to be said that the British approach to how the country is governed, they've left behind with us, and we have not fully managed to shake that off.
So Manu, while British were ruling in India, they also started to write a lot of books about India in English. And I think first, understanding in the European and by extension in Americas about India came from the stories that British were telling, the books they were writing and so on. And many of them were quite stereotypical. The whole image of snake charmers come from that and so on, and in this fakirs on every street and whatnot. What was how were British telling the India story, and who are these characters who were writing these stories and just creating the image of India, which I think India has just taken India all this while throughout the British rule and last 70 years of independence too. We're still fighting that image which got established during those 100 years.
Because colonialism ultimately is about telling that story also, because the British also had to constantly justify why they were here, which means they had to always make brown people look like idiots who didn't know what they were doing. So either they had to be like, these brown people are killing each other, Hindu-Muslim issues, or they had to say that they don't know how to rule themselves because they are useless. In the latter instance, they would look at the Maharajas and they would create this image of the Maharajas as these comical figures who had somehow landed in the 19th and 20th centuries from some ancient past where they should have actually expired in that period. So, for example, there was this, the Nizam of Hyderabad was called His Exalted Highness because, he had helped the British during the First World War. So, where all the Maharajas were called His Highness or Her Highness, in the Nizam's case, it was His Exalted Highness. And there's this popular story that the Maharaja of Patiala had 350 women in his harem and all of that. So, if the Nizam was His Exalted Highness, Patiala was called His Exhausted Highness because he had so many wives. It's a rubbishy story. It's just a way to suggest that these Indian princes were oversexed people constantly in the harem and all of that. There's one record where a certain Raja, it's not clear who, because the author who's written about this hasn't revealed who because he thought he'd get sued for libel. The British accused this one Raja of having romantic feelings for elephants. Impossible, but clearly there were stories that were being told. Now, firstly, at the level of any kind of sexual adventurism, that was not just an Indian trait. Everybody did these things. Queen Victoria's son was constantly jumping in the beds of married women. Lord Curzon, this viceroy who came with a stiff back and a stiff upper lip and judged all Indians and judged all the Indian princes as somehow these undisciplined schoolboys. He himself had affairs with married women. He went skinny dipping in lakes, playing lawn tennis naked and all of that. The thing is, when the white man does it, it doesn't become a story. But when brown people do it, it becomes the story, as opposed to just one aspect of their personality. The same Rajas were also governing their states. Many of them were decent people. You have this Time magazine thing where they say the average Indian Raja has 4 wives, 5 Rolls Royces, la la la. There's this whole statistics that's dished out. It's again rubbish. You've taken a few bad eggs out of the basket and tainted the entire basket saying this is how they are. Whereas in reality, no. The Maharaja of Gondal was a doctor, a trained doctor. The rulers of Cochin were Sanskrit scholars. Sayaji Rao Gaikwad of Baroda was a nationalist. He actually spoke at Congress venues. He supported the Congress party, supported revolutionaries even against the British. The British finally almost got him to abdicate, and that's when he rolled back a little bit. These are people who knew how to play this game. Indian Rajas would start dressing in dull clothes because the British wanted them to dress in silks and satins and pearls and look exotic as if they were museum exhibits. And the Rajas, like in Travancore, they started dressing in dull greys and blacks because they wanted to show the world, no, we are men of business. Just like the white people, we also govern states, we are also serious figures. So they would not do this. They would have ways of sometimes putting the British in their place in subtle ways. So in Travancore, if a white person wanted to see the Raja or the Rani, it would have to be before 8 o'clock in the morning because then they could shake hands with white people and then take a bath before their breakfast to ritually purify themselves. And the British realized this was a way of, the British were political superiors, but the Indians said that we are caste-wise higher than the British who are just mlechas or beyond the pale. So we need a bath every time we shake hands with the British. there's this funny story, again, could be apocryphal, about the Nizam of Hyderabad, where the story goes that to see the Nizam, the official sort of ornate language used was, I would like to see His Highness's feet. That's the language you would use out of respect or whatever. And apparently there was this one Nizam who didn't like a British resident who was there. They were having major issues, or perhaps it was some other Englishman. And when he comes, there's a curtain, and the Nizam's feet literally appear outside the curtain and then get pulled back and said, now you go. You've seen the Nizam's royal feet. That's it. So there are ways in which Indians manage to resist, but also in serious ways. So Maharajas of Mysore, they start pouring money into industrial schemes, not because they want profit. In fact, many of these schemes are guzzling money and not turning any profits. But they want to make a statement that Indians can do science, they can do iron and steel works, they can do the big industries and factories without British support. So there they start investing in it, which is why even Gandhiji and the Congress party till the 1930s, they were quite respectful of the Indian princes, because they did not buy into the British stereotype. They knew that the Indian princes were trying to do something to stand up in their own way to the British Raj. This is not always obvious. So there's this one Maharaja of Indore, Tukojirao Holkar. He, in a letter he writes when Queen Victoria is, sort of crowned Empress of India, he says, before the British came, India was just a heap of stones. Whereas now the British have raised it into this beautiful building, which is to say you have created India in its current form. If you read that letter, on the face of it, yes, he's fawning over the British and sucking up to them. But then you read the private records of the British, intelligence reports and files, the same man is called notoriously disloyal. Because after putting this letter where he's fawning over the British, in reality, he's doing completely opposite things. At one point, he imports some things, I think, I don't know, I forget what he says. On record, it's supposed to be something very basic, some fabric or cotton or something or the other. But in reality, it's arms and ammunition. He was importing it to strengthen his own army. He's writing to all the other Maratha princes in India, telling them, you also stand up to the British, no need to obey the British. So what happens behind the scenes is not necessarily what appears on the face of it. The British, however, constantly peddled this image of natives, as they call them, as completely useless, constantly having sex, constantly oppressing people. That's it. There's nothing more to Indian political authority. These Rajas are just, museumized pieces that actually deserve to just sit in a museum. Somehow they've landed up with some power and we are tolerating them. That's the attitude the British presented.
But this Maharajas also, they've been, even in the post-independence, even the modern narrative, they are very heavily criticized for just, letting British do their own thing, never really putting up a serious fight, just figuring out a way to survive, some cases even thrive to some extent. What is the more nuanced picture? Obviously, there are so many hundreds of them, so it's very difficult to paint all of them with the same brush. But what's your understanding of, what is the typical Maharaja thinking, in around 1900? What do I do? What do I play for?
So much of the bad reputation they have now in India is a post-independence or maybe late 30s, 40s onwards trend, because by that time the Maharajas and the Congress had a falling out. Because the Congress was becoming more and more powerful. Suddenly the Maharajas realized that if the British left, the Congress would then swallow them up also. Then that relationship between the two soured. Till then they were actually perfectly friendly with each other. And then once Indira Gandhi had her famous socialist turn, and she went socialist, she started criticizing the Maharajas. She abolished the privy purse and all of those things. But remember that one of the reasons was that the Maharajas who were getting these privy purses were also funding opposition parties. So it was contemporary politics that made her anti the princes. She, of course, said that, in a poor country, they should not be living these wealthy lives. But in reality, I think the immediate trigger was the fact that the Rajas were supporting the Swatantra Party and other parties that were anti-Congress. And as Congress's dominance was weakening, she realized that I have to cut off the funds that these rival parties are getting, and the Maharajas were a major source of funds. The other thing is, for all these stories that have been built around the Maharajas, many of them have huge cultural capital to this day. That's why so many of them are in the electoral field and winning constantly in their traditional seats, because the people still recognize some sense of loyalty to them. Now, if they were abject villains who never did anything good in life, there's no chance the people would give them that kind of recognition, right? People also are not idiots. They also recognize something. So the narrative of the Maharajas as these completely negative figures comes partly originally from the British, and later the Congress sort of takes it over and they use it because they're also having issues with the Maharajas. But till then, till the 1930s, Congress and Maharajas were quite friendly with each other. Gandhiji was highly resistant to interfering in the princely states.
Are there any examples of these Maharajas who were during those 100 odd years did any like structural reforms? Because look, world was moving forward, the science and technology has really accelerated. World was becoming, more globally integrated. There has been a massive knowledge expansion and so on. And British were, bringing things to India like railways and industry and so on. Are there examples of Maharajas who were progressive for their day and did something foundational, and then maybe the region is still benefiting as a result, got a head start?
Yeah, so if you look at the southern states, Mysore, Travancore and all of these places, they invested heavily in education. And because of that, Kerala is 99% literate for a reason, because that investment in education has gone back to the 19th century. Now, they did it for their own survival. They realized that we have to show that we can govern well, because that's the only way to keep the British at bay. Therefore, they were interested in doing this. But also they realized that it became a kind of calling card for the states to run good administrations, to have education. Remember, one advantage for the Maharajas was that they did not have defense expenses. So in the case of Travancore, in 1805 or so, they agreed to pay some 7 lakhs or 8 lakhs to the British. At that time, it was almost a third of the state's revenue. But by 1947, the state's revenue was 9 crores. And they were still paying only 8 lakhs for defense protection from the British. Which means that the money they would have spent on defense it was spent instead on education and other social sectors and ended up benefiting the people. So in that sense, the princely states often had higher literacy rates than British India. They had higher opportunities than British India because there was greater investment in these things. And then the Rajas were interested in these things. You look at, there's a scholar called Ian Copeland. In India, you have Hindu-Muslim violence happening every now and then in different parts. He actually studies princely states and notices that communal violence was lower in the princely states vis-a-vis British India. And one of the reasons was that the Rajas had so much moral authority that if communities were fighting, they could quite literally sit down with the leaders of the communities, assert almost a patriarchal power and say, look, you guys like children, no? Stop fighting, we're going to sort this out. A British collector who's just a temporary bureaucrat in a certain place, he doesn't have that kind of moral authority. And his tendency is also to be slightly detached. So you end up having more flare-ups in British territory rather than in the princely states. But the princes also, they were extremely clever in how they handled the British. So there was this Raja called Ram Singh in Jaipur. He died around 1880 and he ruled for a good 30 years odd before that. Now Jaipur's treaty with the British, he modernized many things in Jaipur. He brought in new roads, they had gas lamps in the streets, he set up a hospital, he set up a school, for girls, all kinds of things. One thing he did not modernize was the collection of revenue and how the accounts of the state were kept. Why? Because he had a treaty with the British that if the revenue went over 40 lakhs or something, the British would get a slice of it. So he wanted to keep fudging his revenues. So one of the reasons for not modernizing revenue collection was so that the British would never know what his actual revenue was. So his revenue officially was always 39 lakhs, 38 lakhs, 39.5 lakhs, never went over 40 lakhs because he was gaming the British. And the British also knew this. As late as 1906 or so, his successor makes some donations into some British charities, and the British know, they're like, we know why he's doing this, because he doesn't want us to pay attention to his book of accounts. So he's trying to bribe us off by giving us donations into these charitable organizations. You have cases where British officials are bribed by Indians. There's in Indore again, a resident comes and the Rani sends him a basket of fruit for some festival. And he's eating the fruit or whatever, and at the bottom he finds a little sack of gold coins. And he's very offended and he says, how dare you bribe me and all of that. The Rani says, you want more? I'll send more, no problem. Because they were trying to game the system and essentially take control of the loyalties of these white men who were appointed in their courts. So none of these people were innocent. Yes, they were fighting as politicians, political figures. Self-interest was their goal. I'm not saying that these Rajas somehow thought of some great India and wanted to kick the British out. No. They were fighting for their protection, for their states and their identity. But even in that, you find a resistance to imperialism. Even in that, they're standing up to the British. In Baroda, under this Sayaji Rao the third, at one point the Bombay police raids and they go into Baroda territory and they find that bomb manuals and revolutionary material is being produced under jackets of books. The cover will say vegetable medicines and very simple things, but inside it's a bomb manual. And they say, Gaikwad of Baroda is the ruler, and he says, this is happening in your state. Why is there anti-British propaganda being published in your state? And he says, hold on, before we talk about all this, on whose authority did you enter my state? To enter and raid in my property, you need my permission. And without my permission, we're not even getting to that conversation. He was then asked to sack the district officials where this was happening. One of them, he ended up giving 10,000 rupees as a gift when he sacked him, making a very clear statement that I'm sacking you under British pressure, but he's telling all his people, I support you, and I support whatever it is that you've been doing. So the dynamic is a far more interesting, intricate one. And the Sayajirao finally is, in 1911, there was this famous darbar in Delhi where the British king and queen have come. And again, all the Rajas have been told that you must come decked in your diamonds and stand there like these exhibits, just so the king can feel like he's ruling over an exotic empire. And the Rajas all hate this. In Sayaji Rao's case, he actually doesn't show up wearing the famous Baroda diamonds or whatever. Simple white clothes, just one string of pearls with a walking stick in his hand. And there's footage of this on YouTube. If you want, you can look it up on YouTube. Where 1911, where he's supposed to walk up to the king and queen, bow 3 times to each of them, walk back without showing them his own back, and then get off the stage. Instead, as he walks in, he sort of swivels his cane, almost in a casual way, walks up, sort of tilts his head to the king, ignores the queen, turns around and walks down. Later, this becomes a huge sort of thing. This video reel is played in movie halls in Britain. Everybody shouts saying this is sedition, he must be removed from the throne and all of that. And he says, oh damn, now I'm in trouble. He knew this was a bit cheeky. And now he says, oh, I missed the rehearsal. That's why I didn't know what to do. And that's how he tries to escape out of that situation. So some Rajas were bold. They literally to the face of the British king could insult them. Some were more subtle, like the Jaipur guy trying to fudge his accounts and, not give the British their due in terms of the treaty arrangements. And others they would bribe and they would get their way in other ways. So it's a far more interesting story than the cliche that, is around.
In some ways also, the senior officers of the British Empire, they were also kind of new royalty in India. Who were these people? What was their life? How would somebody end up in a, let's say, senior bureaucratic position in India? And from what I understand, all of their living standards in India were probably dramatically better than any of the aristocrats back home. So just any color on their lives, where were they living? How would it look like?
Even a fairly regular civil servant would end up in India, given the kind of salaries they had and the fact that Indians were poor, right? So you could have an ayah, you could have 20 servants, you could have huge comforts if you lived in India. Whereas when you go back to Britain on your next posting, you're back to being in a flat with no help, you have to manage everything yourself. That sort of thing is quite common. You see that even in some literature, etc. At higher levels, they practically lived like kings. So if the viceroys of India, they lived in palaces, they lived in these huge houses. They practically imitated kingly forms in every sense. They had almost like thrones and things like that. Their public functions were these great sort of events. To the extent that Lord Curzon, when I think one of Victoria's sons came, he said, look, I am the viceroy, I represent the crown. So the prince can't be higher than me because I'm technically representing his mummy, which is the queen. And therefore, he actually managed to do that. He actually suggested that I am therefore senior to the prince or to whoever the monarch was at that time. And the visitor was at that time. So there was that politics also between them. They had very grand styles and grand lifestyles. They traveled a great deal, shooting elephants and this and that. But again, the important thing is that we now sometimes put these people down as villains, like, quote them all in black and say all these English people were villains. There also the story is slightly more nuanced. So the same Lord Curzon, he's notorious for partitioning Bengal along religious lines, Hindu and then Muslim Bengal, which is now Bangladesh. At the same time, much as that is not something nice that he did, he's also the man who started putting more and more money into the archaeological survey of India. There are monuments in different parts of India that he has quite literally saved from ruin. There are several places where you have stories of Curzon being there on tour and then discovering that that particular mausoleum or that particular Mughal monument was being used as a post office, being used as some kind of government outpost. He would kick them out on the spot and say, are you crazy? This is a historical monument. It has to be treated like a historical monument. If you visit the Taj Mahal, he had an important role in giving it its current appearance and shape, the gardens and things like that. And also, I think there's a lamp hanging on top of the tomb, which is something he commissioned from Egypt and brought it here and hung it over the tombs. In Andhra Pradesh, one of my favorite examples is this guy called Arthur Cotton. Every year, his birthday is celebrated even now in the 21st century as a Jayanti by local farmers. Farmers gather around. There are an estimated 3,000 statues of Arthur Cotton in Andhra Pradesh in that Godavari belt. And people garland him. Politicians show up. His family is sometimes invited to come and participate. Why? Because although he was an evangelical Christian who thought he was here to civilize natives, he's the one who irrigated that entire tracts with canals. Having brought canals into that tract, he brought water to the people. He transformed their lives, which is why he's still treated with so much regard, even though he was a foreigner, even though he was an imperialist. In fact, recently a bureaucrat was telling me that he's seen puja rooms in people's houses with Arthur Cotton's picture in it.
Incredible.
Because even now, people don't see him as this black and white villain. They see him as somebody who brought water to their fields.
I think what you are alluding to in some ways, we can discuss history from, in terms of just broad concepts and so on. but ultimately it's a history of people.
Yeah.
And there were huge number of people involved on both sides. These Maharajas on one hand, elite Indian on the other hand, common Indian. Then from the British side also, the senior officials, and then the people who are just operating on the ground and so on. All of their lives and histories and quite enmeshed, which is part of the larger heritage now. It doesn't need to be all vilified.
And some of it is very quaint, sweet stories. There's this Maratha queen called Baizabai, and there was a lady called Fanny Parks, an English woman who came to see her. And Baizabai being a queen, she sent out a full retinue of Maratha women on horses to escort this white lady. It might not be Fanny Parks actually, it might be the sisters of a viceroy. I think it was the sisters of the viceroy. So they were being escorted in state by the Rani, and all these Maratha women had come in their silk saris, and they were on horses and all of that. These women were very impressed, wow, these women have showed up on horses, they're decked in jewelry and all of that. Suddenly the procession stops at a certain point, and this visiting English lady is like, what's happened? And it turns out all these Maratha women are wearing their heaviest jewelry, including nose rings and earrings that really hurt. And they basically stop the procession saying, we need to take these off because on the horses these things are hanging and it's hurting them. It's a small little detail, but it brings so much of human flavor and life to that episode, right? Suddenly, okay, forget it's British and Indians and they don't actually get along, but there's a certain human quality that's quite sweet and quite charming in stories like this. So you see occasionally these, a more human side to things. You see people acting in a much more humane way. They are also creatures of their own circumstances. They're also not here because they've willingly joined some imperialist project. Many of them have come to India for jobs. Many of them come for security. In Britain, it was often the case that in aristocratic families, the eldest son will inherit. But there'll be 7 younger brothers. What do you do with them? 2 or 3 you throw into the church, saying go become churchmen. The others have to find employment. And that was often in the East in India. And then that's how they would end up coming here. There's a book by David Gilmour which talks about people escaping to India for all kinds of reasons. Women who have suddenly, unmarried women who've gotten pregnant in England will get on a ship and come to India to escape before their reputation is damaged. There was something called I think it was called fishing boats or something else, which was a pejorative way of referring to spinsters from Britain who were unmarried, and then they would sail off to India in the hope that here maybe some soldier would end up marrying them. So there's also a social side to it, and that social side is interesting. It's not a question of good or bad. It's interesting. There are all kinds of exchanges that are happening.
At its peak, how many British citizens were here?
Not more than a few 100,000. 2 lakhs.
That's it.
Yeah, 2 lakhs, 3 lakhs, maybe.
Only 200,000, not
It
even million.
wasn't more than that. At least as far as I'm aware, no, I don't think so.
No, we'll fact check this, but yeah, it's surprisingly small.
It's surprisingly small. It's in lakhs. It's never more than lakhs. It's never more, certainly not a million. I don't even think it was 5 lakhs. It was definitely less than that. There isn't a way to get a sort of fixed number because it obviously keeps shifting. But all the numbers I've seen are in the lakhs. They're never more than that.
What were the terms of, the independence? Do all of them had to go back, or some of them had the provision of converting somehow to being Indian citizen? Or?
Many, I think, stayed back. See, initially, many people in military positions stayed back because we needed their military leadership. Remember, over Kashmir, we were already fighting a war with Pakistan. And at that time, a lot of military leadership, senior leadership, people who had the technical know-how, engineers, etc., many of them stayed on under the Indian government also. In places like Bangalore, till the 70s, there was a huge number of Europeans who stayed on because a lot of the companies were based in Bangalore, international companies. And their heads preferred to stay in Bangalore because Bangalore had good weather, as the old stereotype goes. And they stayed on, and it was only when Indira Gandhi passed some legislation where she said that in companies, majority ownership has to be Indian. That's when these companies either exited or they sold their businesses to Indians. And a lot of these Europeans were then pulled back. In places like Shimla, etc., a lot of people stayed on because they had retired from the British service, made their home there, and they just decided to carry on and continue there. But these are just, fringe stories, really. The main set of cast of characters always left.
So one of the biggest, legacy of British is the partition, which was incredibly painful. How did this whole, this idea of India and Pakistan, at what time it started to gain hold, and who were key characters, who were shaping this narrative all the way to, where eventually they decided to go through the painful process of actually dividing country into 2, which eventually became 3. So yeah, when and how this whole thing started?
So let's go back a little bit. So when the Congress Party is founded, the British are not happy. Initially, they think it's just going to be a bunch of English-speaking elites coming and sort of yapping away like in a debate society. And you find Congress being lampooned. This is like some children's debating society. These people have no relevance beyond their elite circles. They don't represent the country. And yet, they were so effective in making that moral case for Indians as a nation that very quickly, within 2-3 years, the British realized, okay, hold on, this is going to be a problem. At that time itself, there was a body found called the United India Alliance or something. I forget the full acronym. But it was intended as a counter to the Congress and tacitly supported by the British. It included a few landlords, a few Rajas, important Muslim figures, etc., saying Congress does not represent us. And this is never going to be a democracy. There are some really offensive sentences also in their proceedings. At one point, there's somebody who says that if Congress's dreams of democracy happen, mochis and lower castes will be ruling over us. Who can think of anything more obscene and problematic than this? Their words, not mine, saying on the record. So this was meant as a conservative sort of body that was supposed to be anti-Congress. Now, initially also, you have organizations like the Muslim League, etc., coming in out of a fear that the Congress represents chiefly Hindu interests. And this is true to a certain extent, because the early Congress, in their internal debates also, you find that they're not able to woo that many Muslim leaders. Now, other Muslims may come, but there are accredited, recognized leaders like major princes, major community figures. They are not showing that much interest in the Congress, or the British are actively keeping them away. So at this point, there's this fear that the Congress represents chiefly a Hindu thing. And even if India becomes democratic in future, and democracy is the most scary thing, because democracy is built on numbers. And in numbers, if there's a Hindu majority, then Muslims will end up being governed by Hindus. That's the fear. And fanning this fear is essentially how the Muslim League starts getting ahead, which is that this is not going to work out for us, especially Muslim elites at that time. They think that they deserve a larger number of seats at the table rather than just what population provides them. Obviously, there are hard, right-wing sections within the Congress who say absolutely not. If it's democracy in numbers, it's democracy in numbers. It doesn't matter what religion it is. That's just how it's going to operate. It's complicated. It's a messy kind of debate. But that's where the original sort of seed of the idea of Pakistan emerges. The idea that there is not just one, but two nations in this country.
When was this two nation theory first floated?
In a different form, I would say from the 1910s itself. Okay. Although it was formally articulated in the 1930s, I would imagine. But from the 1910s itself, you start seeing the people falling back on this idea that Muslims are not one community in India. They are a different nation in India. It's a way of transcending that problem of numbers. Because if you're a community in the country, that number matters. But if you say you're two nations in a country, you're saying two equal nations, numbers don't matter, two equal nations. So that's how the Muslim League starts building up this nation concept, saying that we are a different nation in the country. Sometimes right-wing Hindu leaders also fall into that trap. Savarkar at one point, as a Hindu Mahasabha leader, in a speech does acknowledge that there are two nations in this country. So this argument slowly starts building up. Essentially, it's originally meant as a kind of bargaining tool, I feel. If you read it, it feels like initially even the people saying it were not entirely convinced it was ever going to pan out. Yeah. It was a way of negotiating with the Congress and trying to get a good deal for the Muslim community. Yeah. At some point in the late 30s and into the 40s, that shifts. Jinnah has been out in the wilderness for several years. In fact, there's an apocryphal story. They say that at one point, Jinnah, he had finished up in India. He had gone off to live in London for some time. And the story goes that somebody told him that at some dinner party, Nehru said, Jinnah is finished. He's never going to be anything again in India. Mm. And just to spite Nehru and just out of a sense of vengeance, Jinnah came right back and decided to rejoin Indian politics. Mm. That's just a story. I don't know how true it is. But he then comes onto the scene. And remember, Second World War is a critical period, right? Because Gandhiji declares quit India. The British are like, we're fighting a war. We have no patience to deal with Gandhiji's freedom struggle here. Throw all these people in jail. Earlier, as we discussed, Congress had participated in the elections. They had resigned from all that. The British were now trying to get local political parties on their side. Muslim League sucked up and said, we'll support you. So suddenly the Muslim League, from a relatively fringe position, comes more and more to the center. And they become more and more powerful. And slowly it starts becoming clear that this bargaining chip of, this is two nations and therefore the Muslim community deserves a certain larger share of the pie than pure numbers suggest. That becomes more and more a real possibility that you might end up getting something different. There are some accounts and some theories that right down to 1947, Jinnah didn't actually expect it would pan out. So, see, a lot of this is what ifs and speculation. It's not entirely clear because so many pieces were moving around that I don't think anybody really knew where they would all land ultimately. But it was becoming clear that something would have to be done at that particular point. Unfortunately, it didn't work out. The arrangements made either did not please the Congress, because either it would have been a very decentralized country, which the Congress thought was very dangerous and they wanted a centralized country, or it was partition at one point. Partition ends up happening and But
There's
the
this
rest is
other,
history.
there's other story about Gina. I don't know. Again, you tell me if it's true or not. That like towards the around the partition time, he was terminally ill, and he knew of his illness, but he didn't make sure no one can find out, right? And within 6 months of, I think, partition, he was dead, right?
Yeah.
And if Britishers or even Indian politician knew, it would have changed. People would have delayed things, etc.
The origin of the story is largely Lord Mountbatten, the last viceroy. He first, I think this appears in Dominic Clapper and Larry
Freedom
Collins'
at
book,
Midnight,
Freedom at Midnight. That's why I think the story first appears. And a good source for that book was Lord Mountbatten. He cooperated a lot with the authors. And I think it was Lord Mountbatten's personal position, perhaps, which is that if he had known that Jinnah was going to die so quickly or so soon, perhaps he would have delayed independence a little bit. But I think it's more a retrospective kind of thing. That's the other thing, right? We did not dismantle a lot of institutions when they left, and with good reason, because the country was unstable. I don't think embarking on an adventure, dismantling things would have been very wise at that time. So the ICS officers ended up becoming our civil servants after independence. So till 1947, 15 August, they had been serving the British. They continued to serve, except that now the government had changed. The people at the top had changed. But that work culture then still remains the same a little bit, no? Because you're bringing that baggage with you. The same extends to the Indian Army. Remember that, the Indian Army had fought in the world wars under the King's name. And then after independence, it transitioned to us. So the army is another place where a lot of colonial language, etc. has continued. A lot of patterns have continued. And they are very attached to it. And for various reasons. Some of them are also good reasons. But, that's one of those facts again. In fact, historically, that's one thing in school, elsewhere, we never learn about India's contribution to the two world wars. Because after independence, we felt almost a sense of shame that an Indian army, Indian soldiers went out there and died in the thousands for a foreign king. But today, I think we should look at it differently. In the First World War, it was a world war. Indians went out and they fought in parts of Europe, in parts of Africa, here and there. In fact, during the Boxer Rebellion in China, also in many years before, Indian troops were present. The troops of Maharajas were present. At the end of the First World War, when the Treaty of Versailles was signed, there's a big painting commemorating that called the Signing of the Peace, I think, or just the peace, I'm not sure. There's an Indian in it, and the Indian is the Maharaja. It's an Indian Maharaja who's actually signing on behalf of India at that time. Indians have died for a world war. It's something we should actually be proud of, especially the Second World War, a fight against fascism. The fact that Indian soldiers went out there is not something to be embarrassed about. It's something that I think is part of our military traditions and history. And just because it happened under the British, we should not erase that or not talk about it. In fact, there's a book by Vedika Kant and others have also written about it. The First World War, the Indian soldiers who went out, some of them wrote back to their families in Uttar Pradesh and other places. It's the sweetest letters. They're describing Europe. They're talking about how they're missing eating rotis and things like that. You see that these young boys who've just been recruited by the army. For them, it's not about India, British, nothing. They frankly just want to survive. They want a salary, and if this is what it takes, it's how it's going to be.
And these letters are still around in some archives.
They're available in some archives. That's how these scholars have published some of them, and sort of studied some of them. And it's almost sweet to read some of it because you're almost connecting to a 17-year-old who lived 100 years before you, but it's a 17-year-old kid or an 18-year-old kid writing back to his mother or writing back to his young wife who doesn't know if he's going to come back. In some cases, they didn't come back. And these women ended up being widows. These are our stories. They're not stories of the British. Just because the British were there, these are humans of our, flesh and blood. And therefore, we should be telling their stories. So I think there is a lot to be excavated that way. Not just in terms of how colonialism has continued into our present, and therefore some people want to decolonize everything and change everything. But even in the way we engage with things that happened during the colonial period, we haven't told all the stories that need to be told.
Yeah. What do you think when the British were leaving India in 1947 and someone told them 75 years from now, Prime Minister of your country will be somebody called Rishi Sunak? What would have been the reaction or belief in that?
I'm thinking of Churchill. Churchill, thought of Indians as a beastly people with a beastly religion. And to think that a beastly man with that beastly religion now sits in his chair in the same office is something that would have given Churchill an aneurysm, I think. So definitely in Churchill's case, he would have collapsed into a heap of despair if he had ever known that this was going to happen.
I think most of England would have probably collapsed. Yeah, I mean, the good thing about our world now is obviously very, very global, right? There is a continuous migration, mixing, and borrowing of culture from each other. So we're becoming very, very homogeneous, and and I guess there's other. We're not discussing today's episode, but there's an emergence of Indian professionals all around the world. I mean, Microsoft, Google, so many Silicon Valley companies and so on. that just, outstanding. And probably some of the roots of that still goes back much earlier in history. Like why, so many Indians doing so well in America today. It's probably not, it's phenomenon didn't start last 20 years.
I think the lesson to be drawn there is that if placed in situations where the environment or the context is conducive, Indians are able to shine. Which also then poses the question, why are we not able to create that environment in our country? Just imagine, right? If simply by transplanting yourself from here to a place where the best can be made of your talents, you're achieving so much. Imagine what could be achieved here if we are able to build up that kind of climate. It's not about individuals succeeding. It's about creating a system in which success is valued. And success is what motivates people.
Well, the good thing is it's all out there now. People are able to see it, and which is also like seeing so many Indians doing so well in West is also giving confidence to people back home. Sometimes you need these validations, etc., which unfortunately as a country for many centuries we did not get. We were oppressed and ruled by somebody or other in different times, and I think, but we're probably last vestiges of shaking off, like at least the bad part of colonial hangover, and there's probably good things also which are part of cultural heritage. But I think among all of this, there's the stories of people is the most interesting part.
It always is, no? Because ultimately, if we, in general also, when we want to sort of connect with history, it's always easier to connect with the human stories in history because we instinctively recognize those struggles. We instinctively recognize those stories. It's almost like, we weren't there in that time, but somehow we can connect and align with what's happening because we can get into their heads. We recognize every impulse, every emotion, every feeling that they're going through. And that, I think, is perhaps a good way to get people to take an interest in history also. Just to highlight those human stories, bring out that emotional texture of history, as opposed to just the hard facts. Because even in our present, it's not just the hard facts, right? Every guest you've had here, they're also talking about their life. They're also talking about their journey. They're also talking about who they've been and how they've got to their places. They're not talking about the hard figures of how much profit they've made or what companies they've built. They're talking about themselves and their growth also as individuals. And people connect to that. If they're doing that in the present, they can do that with past figures also.
And I've noticed in the, the way you study history and the books you've written, you really spend a lot of time in kind of human treatment of the subjects, just what their everyday life was. Is this a kind of style of studying and narrating history you have somewhat developed on your own, or you think a lot of good historians focus on human aspect of historical figures?
I don't know if others, I don't think it's a conscious thing. It's simply that I'm interested in it, and therefore that shows in my writing in a very direct way. But yes, I think others may have also done it. Anybody who has an emphasis on biographical elements of history, it inevitably shows up. For me, having to explain, say, even a controversial figure like Tipu Sultan, it's important for me not just to look at his battles, the buildings he built, etc. Who was he as a person? How do I get inside his head? What was he writing in his dream diaries? What was he writing in his letters? What was he? Who was he when he was not in these kingly circumstances, in these kingly settings? What was that person there? There's a very charming biography of Emperor Jahangir by Parvati Sharma. Or even earlier, like Babur the Invader, who came into India first. This guy's written an autobiography.
Yeah, Baburnama.
Baburnama. It's a very transparent one. At one point, he talks about how he's fallen head over heels in love with a boy in some market that he's seen. And it's just pining for this boy for the next few pages or whatever. He talks about that. Jahangir, he funny things that humanize this Mughal emperor. He talks about how somebody presented him a zebra and he didn't believe that this was a real animal. He thought it was a horse with paint on it. So he had the zebra washed to make sure it wasn't some fake colored horse that he was being sold. It's suddenly, this distant emperor sitting on the peacock throne becomes a curious little man who's just, trying to wash a zebra and see whether there is something hidden under its skin like that. So that I think brings out a certain life in history. It brings out a humor in history. This human side of things, I think, makes us understand things with less judgment. We see them not necessarily as historical figures of mold A or mold B, but as individuals. They can have good traits, they can have bad traits, but they're individuals. And therefore, we connect with them better.
No, that is a fascinating area. I think, in the last few hundred years of history, there are a lot of characters who have played, big role, and we probably know about their deeds and actions and, the output they produce. But probably in the next episode, we'll deep dive into their lives and the human side of, of who they were in their everyday life, their quirks and follies and, everyday adventures and so on. So I think it'll be a fascinating conversation, Manu. Looking forward to that. But it's great today. I think we managed to cover, great deal of topics which relate to the continued lingering effect of colonialism in India. But I also am very optimistic. I think a lot of it is probably is good to talk about, but I think we see that we are shedding that every decade.
Yeah.
A lot of things are changing. Even the newer India is a lot more bold.
Yeah.
They don't have all these hangovers, and they will think independently, speaking different language and so on. And probably going forward we can develop deeper nuanced understanding of what happened during all those years, and preserve the good and get rid of the bad, and move on in life.
I am very optimistic for the simple reason that my books people are reading, and that itself shows that young people are interested in the past, and not in a way where they're either self-flagellating or judging it or anything. They're genuinely curious without being affected by it in any direct sense. Like, they don't feel some sense of shame. You can talk about complicated areas and they're like, fine, we understand that there were complicated areas. They don't take it as a personal attack. They don't take it as a personal thing. They see it as, okay, it was complicated, so what? Move on. We live in the 21st century. Just because our ancestors did something wrong or something that shouldn't have been done is not a reflection on us. We are moving in a different direction in a different time. So I'm also a fairly optimistic, hopeful person.
And I think you're doing incredible work of making history interesting and relevant and bringing all these human stories.
Thank you.
Let's continue our conversation next episode.
See you there.
Thank you. At SparX, we aim to bring to you stories of exponential impact. We share in-depth analysis of what goes behind success stories. If you find our conversations interesting, you can join us by subscribing to our YouTube channel. You can also listen to SparX on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or any other audio platform of your choice. If you have any suggestions on who we should invite or what topics we need to cover, just let us know in the comments. We are always listening, looking for ways to improve, and keep getting better as we go along.